MSP Confidential. It's a Friday, January 17th, already halfway through January, and it's kind of crazy to think about. We're already in 2025. We are expecting our guest for today, Nick Mehta, to join us shortly. I know that he was running a little bit late today. And so in the meantime, I wanted to remind everybody we are hosting our Ignition event next week, January 23rd. If you just visit us at scalepad.com, you'll see all sorts of information about joining us for Ignition. And we've been on this very interesting track of customer success and trying to understand what this means for the MSP industry, how the industry is shifting towards this mindset of customer success. And hopefully that's some of the topics I can get into a little bit with Nick Mehta today. We'll give him a couple more minutes to join us. Now, over the last couple of weeks or so, there's been a number of interesting conversations happening on LinkedIn and a number of different watering holes, along with Alex Farling, Todd Kane, and some of the podcasts I've been on, the MSP Growth Hub podcast, around this topic of vCIO and account management. And it's been really interesting to try and get into this conversation because it's clear and evident now that it seems like there's a lot of opinions about what vCIO means, what account management means, what roles MSPs should be trying to cover with this function or this role title, so to speak. And so I'm loving the conversation. Definitely hit us up for more of that over the next little while. I'm going to be in Tampa next week, attending the vCIO University vCIO workshop that they're putting on. Chris Ryan, Jim Terrella, they do some really good work. And if your MSP is actually thinking about bringing this onto the... Oh, here's Nick joining us now. Hey, Nick, how you doing?
Hey, good, thanks. Good to see you.
Good. Give me a sec. Let me assign you here to the placeholder. And
Sure.
now, I have this whole intro prepared for you because I have it on good authority that you are okay with a little bit of self-deprecating humor, and
I
so
don't, I live for it. Yeah.
somehow this made it into my inbox. It's the Roastmaster GPT introduction
Oh,
to Nick
yeah.
Mehta. Nick Mehta, the CEO, who's basically LinkedIn's version of a motivational speaker crossed with a walking TED Talk. His profile is so packed with self-congratulatory fluff, you'd think he invented customer success and maybe sliced bread on the side. Every post feels like he's one humble brag away from launching a course called How to Succeed at Success. And if enthusiasm alone could solve world hunger, this guy would be a Nobel laureate. But alas, it's mostly just enough to fill your feed with corporate Kool-Aid. Welcome to MSP Confidential, Nick. So good to have you here. I appreciate you making the time to hang out for a bit.
Awesome. Thanks for having me here. I love that intro. When I saw it the first time, Roastmaster, I was like, oh my God, this is somebody seeing into my soul in the worst way. So yeah, it was fun.
Well, you're pretty easygoing on LinkedIn and the social media platforms, and one of the things you do a lot is actually you kind of use music or song quotes to kind of set the tone for your posts. We know you're a Swiftie fan at this point, and so that's kind of
Yeah,
how I decided to intro our conversation for today. Long live all the mountains we've moved, and it kind of
I
speaks to
love it.
this.
Well
Yeah.
done. Are you a Swiftie as well?
By association, there's enough people in this industry that are Swifty fans that I can't help
Okay.
it. And I've started to notice we talk about champagne problems now in the IT industry. So definitely very Swifty tinged, let's just say. So
I love it.
right on. Well, Nick, it's a pleasure to have you. In many ways, you need no introduction. One of the evolution people around the customer success conversation. And you know what? I'm going to just move your camera here a tiny bit to get you roughly. There we go. Perfect. I've been talking about customer success internally with our team, our CEO, Chris Day, who I know you caught up with recently and had an
Great.
interesting conversation about customer success. And to set the tone a bit for this conversation and for the people listening in, which are mostly in the IT industry, a service-based industry, our product is people in many ways, not SaaS software or anything like that. So there's a lot of interesting parallels. But, 2013, you became CEO of Gainsight, roughly, I
Right.
think.
Correct.
Um, why customer success, and what was sort of that moment that said, I think this is the next thing, I need to transition into this? What was kind of
Yeah,
going through your mind?
totally.
Yeah.
So I ran another software company before Gates, another SaaS company. And in that running that company, it was kind of early in the SaaS days, and we didn't have all the kind of best practices and terminology that companies and MSPs or software have today. We didn't have all that back then. And but we had a customer that was paying us on a monthly, quarterly, annual basis. Actually, probably very similar to folks that are in the MSP world, where the terminology may not always be used of customer success,
Sure.
but we had the need to preserve recurring revenue. Like that was a big issue. And I saw in running that company that it was like so critical for us, like staying on top of customers and the value they're getting and their consumption of our products and services and their sentiment. And it was critical. As CEO, I got really involved in it. We eventually sold the company and I took some time off and I spent some time with a VC firm looking at ideas to start a new company. And I basically had an idea to say, hey, let's go solve the problem I had faced in my last company. And then I met through some, serendipity in the Valley, two other entrepreneurs who had the same idea. And so we kind of joined up and launched Gainsight in 2013. And so it was really out of my own personal experience that I got passionate about it because I just saw this is going to be something everyone's going to need. Of course, back then, it was pretty early, so there weren't a lot of
Yeah.
customer success managers out there, and the best practices weren't out there. We put a lot of work trying to help over the years in trying to create more best practices, but it was pretty much the Wild West back then. And maybe that's similar to how MSPs are going through this evolution of thinking about their clients in a more strategic way.
Yeah, it's kind of this focus on customer centricity is what's kind of starting to take a bit of the limelight.
Right.
For 20 years, it's been a lot about, how do we make operations more efficient? How do we actually, get things operating smoothly inside of the MSP? And now there's a clear need to get more in front of the customer needs and their business outcomes. And because a lot of the other work, what used to be special, managing servers, managing equipment, whatever, has been largely commoditized at this point.
Oh, totally.
So let me ask you about the best practices. You talk about, putting more of that. I guess methodology is the term I want to use here out there, and this is interesting. I'm Lincoln Murphy is one of the people I've been on his lists for a long time, and I get a lot of his content. He was one of your co-writers, co-authors on one of your customer success books early on, and just tell me a bit about how you thought with regards to best practices and methodology. Because when nothing really exists, like how do you even determine where this needs to go? I thought that was always interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting because we wrote this first book. Some folks may know about it. It's called Customer Success, really creative title. And we published it in 2015. And Lincoln Murphy, who's kind of an industry luminary, myself, and actually the person did really the majority of the work is a guy named Dan Steinman, who was our first chief customer officer. And so the three of us, wrote this, although Dan did the majority of the work. And the way we wrote it, or really, Dan and all of us wrote it, was I taking like 10 topics that we thought were critical to customer success. And we actually turned those into what we call the 10 laws of customer
Hmm.
success. And those laws are things like nail onboarding, product is priority number one, you can't depend on relationships, things like that. And so we had these 10 principles. And then what we did was pick 10 companies smarter than us that had a little further along that had been thinking about these problems and that, the kind of early SaaS companies that had actually done work in customer success. For example, we were really fortunate to get a foreword written by Maria Martinez, who was at the time the head of customer success and actually kind of like effectively the chief customer officer at Salesforce. And so she's obviously like a pioneer in the space. And we had maybe about a dozen other companies that we interviewed, maybe a little more than that. And in this book, we then wrote their stories about for each of these 10 principles, what do they do? What do they do to nail onboarding? What do they do to make product the
Right.
number one priority? So that was how we created that first one. Then over time, you can imagine like we didn't create anything. We just know a lot of smart people.
Observationist, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And so we knew a lot of these companies. And then over the years, we actually have written 5 books. We run a big conference every year in the US, thousands of people there. We run one in Europe, about 1,000 people there. And all of these are like bringing the best ideas out of the world of customer success together. In fact, I just got off a call with the chief customer officer of a large publicly traded SaaS company, and she was taking me about how they're evolving things even more. And
Mm.
so it's constantly changing, which is fun. And we're constantly learning from all these amazing customer success leaders and CEOs and others. And then we just try to share, create a forum for them to speak and write, things like that.
Now, as some of this stuff evolves, obviously the industry shifts. Some of the stuff becomes more clear and in focus. Have you thought back to these original 10 principles and whether there needs to be a revised edition?
Oh, we've done it. We did a revised version. Yes, like things don't stay the same, right? And we did a revised version. We didn't need to do another one because like things are changing again,
Yeah.
particularly with AI. And so yeah, we've actually revised it a few times for that reason.
Well, and the 10 law maybe a structure kind of made its way also into customer
Yeah,
communities, which when you acquired Insighted, within a couple of years, you also released a book on that. So clearly, a bit of the book mantra is the thing that leads a bit of the setting, the methodology tone for the industry, and maybe talk through a bit of the customer community piece, because in the MSP industry, community is a big deal amongst MSPs.
yeah,
But I find it interesting that MSPs don't necessarily create community for their customers, and they're kind of separate. Like the customers in the industries have communities certainly, but not between the MSPs. I find interesting. But
yeah.
but what was your kind of realization of like, well, maybe were you using Insighted before you decided to acquire them?
Yeah, great question. So many good questions there. So I'll answer the last one just because it's simple. Yes, we were using it and we really liked it. But zooming out, one of the things that we observed was that we ourselves built our company off community, right? Not just online community, which is for folks, kind of that don't know, Insighted, which is now called Gainsight Customer Community, is technology that lets you build an online community for people to share best practices, to connect with each other, to kind of also a portal for all your documentation, support, all that. So we were using that. But more generally, we had built our company on community because we have this big conference that I mentioned that is all about community. All the events we do are about people coming together. Everything in Gainsight is about community. And so that's been from the beginning. And so sort of naturally in our ethos. But equally important, we thought the spirit of customer success is about community. Like, so for example, if our customers are trying to build a customer success program and they're trying to drive more value for their customers, in fact, some folks watching might be in this zone. One thing you can do, of course, is have people on your team that are helping the customer, right? That's great. But maybe equally important, maybe even better, is having customers talk to each other. Because lots of times, if a customer wants to learn, the most compelling way for them to learn is to talk to another customer, right? And because they just speak the same language, they understand sort of what, the same industry and things like that. And so we thought that community is the heart of not only what we do, but the concept of customer
Mm.
success in general. And if you look up the definition of community on like, on Google and dictionary.com, you get it's a feeling of fellowship from kindred spirits or something to that effect. And it's about not about technology, it's not about business, it's about there are people out there like me. And so in our world, we created this community for customer success people. And if you go to our events, people love it because they're like, oh, I'm not the only one going through these challenges. There's other people like me. You guys have created a community of MSPs, right? And so you have a community probably when you have your events and different like sessions like this, people can connect together and see that they're not alone. There's other people like them. And maybe that's true for some of your customers watching as well, the people that are on this event. And so, what we did was we said, hey, this software that we're using is great. We love community. Maybe we buy this software. And so we bought this company Insighted about 3 years ago, and it's done really well because it fits very naturally into what we do. It's a great product, so that of course helps, but it fits very naturally into what we do and to our buyer and all that. So yeah, huge part of what we do now is community.
Yeah, and the way I've actually seen a bit of the community starting to show up in MSP to customer relationships is through customer advisory boards,
Yeah.
MSPs that get to a certain growth profile. They start to realize, hey, it'd actually be really interesting to bring customers in to give us, some advisory and some opinion and some thought on how they see us evolving and providing service, because it's so service heavy, of course, that the customer
Totally.
sentiment is so, it's not just a product. Like, everything is, the relationships are at the root of everything with MSP. So I see that happening. I love that. Now, the you talk about the company purpose at Gainsight being to be living proof you can win in business while being human first, and I think this is such an interesting parallel for MSPs to think about, because we often talk about MSPs being accidental business owners, very technical people.
Yeah, right.
And so, tell me a bit of like how you see that shaping a bit of the culture and value that you create for your customers through Gainsight.
Yeah, yeah. First off, the accidental business owner resonates. I know a few technical folks out here that became MSPs, and it resonates a lot.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's great business. When we came up with that purpose statement, it was actually in 2016, and we were a little company, tiny little startup, maybe 50 people in the company, and for a software company is quite small. And we were in a offsite, and we had to kind of like define our vision and our goals. And some folks watching may have gone through that exercise before. And one of the things was defining what our purpose of our company was. And we always thought it was more than just software. The software is important, but it's kind of a means to an end. We also thought it was more than just making money, which obviously is great, but more another means to an end. And so we kind of came up with this statement. Actually, my chief operating officer at the time, Allison Pickens, is the one who coined it, which is to be living proof you can win in business while being human first.
Mhm.
And the idea basically of human first is that in business, it's easy to kind of become like, kind of in zombie mode. You go to meeting, you want to close this deal, you want to keep this customer, you want to fix this technical issue. But meanwhile, there's a human being on the other side of that relationship, a human being that runs a, doctor's office that's about to, need some help with technology, a human being that is in a law firm that has an outage right now, right? There's a human being like that might literally be like worried about their job or stressed or trying to get home to their family, right? And whether it's a customer, whether it's a potential customer, whether it's an employee, whether it's a exiting employee, all of them are human beings first. And I think in business, it's easy for us to forget about that. It's very natural because you just kind of go from meeting to meeting, but it's powerful if you don't forget about it and you hold that kind of sacred that these are
Mhm.
humans that we are dealing with, right? Doesn't mean not going to run a good business. Doesn't mean you don't want to make money. Those are really important things too. But don't forget about the human part.
And along the same lines of not forgetting about the business part, maybe, if you flip it on its head a little bit, you've talked a bit about this idea that, let me see if I can find it, because I wrote down the quote. You've talked about the purist argument of customer success, because it seems like you maybe there's a tinge around customer success. It can tend to be or feel philosophical in nature, and that people
Yeah.
don't really put the rubber to the road, so to speak. And so you talk about this idea of helping the customer, long term value. It's not about the transaction, but the reality is that something needs to drive both short term and long term commercial value specifically.
Right.
And in the industry that we're in with MSPs, I think this is more true than ever. Maybe you can speak to any experiences you've had with an MSP delivering IT services for you in the past. But we have found that small business customers have long abdicated their IT to their providers, and there was never a relationship to speak of, because there was inherent value in just having their IT managed. But now we're sort of so far apart from that value being perceived that MSPs have to reinvent themselves now. And so the commercial value is a big piece. We've been talking about customer success in the MSP context, but we can't forget that they're there to ultimately drive commercial value. And so I wanted to ask you about this comment about the commercial value, and to not be
Yeah.
so philosophical, I guess.
100%. Yeah, I think that it's interesting because when you're technical, which I know a lot of folks in the MSP world are, right? Because that's great. That's what you do. You also can't forget that there's a business side of it, right?
Mm,
And so there are opportunities that I think some technical folks can miss to like sell more services or make sure the client is really happy so they're going to stay. Because of course, like, the danger is you're happy with the transaction, like you fixed my issue. You're not happy with the ongoing relationship, but you don't tell anyone, and then all of a sudden you have found a new MSP, right? I'd imagine some folks watching have experienced things like that before. And we've been through it. It's interesting because we had an MSP in the very early days of Gainsight and a really great firm, like really enjoyed working with them. But we had some outages and it's a classic thing where it wasn't really their fault. It was like Wi-Fi in our building, like problems. So can't really blame it was like physics. But nonetheless, like we had an IT department, we were growing, like, we had a CIO and it sort of like slipped away. We might still do some business with them and they're great, but I'm sure they could be doing more with us in a different like approach. And that's not to be critical of them. It's like I said, they're a great firm.
Um,
But more generally, it's like, hey, how do you have the bigger picture view of this relationship beyond that? Like, I've fixed this outage, or I've installed this, I've fixed their backups or installed this new security software, whatever a given MSP is doing. I think the commercial mindset, it's not rocket science. It's like literally, what are some things you should be looking for? And I'm sure some of the owners of firms that are watching, you wouldn't be where you're at if you don't do this already to some extent. But as you hire your staff, how can you get them to have the light skills to be able to look for those opportunities to do more? Because I'm always a believer, you're either doing more for a client or you're on the path to doing less. So there's no status quo. If you're just managing their network and they're not doing any of the advanced value services, I'm sure that they're going to go somewhere else over time. Uh, yeah, so at least my perspective. I'm not an expert in your field, so yeah.
that's going to be my first note of this conversation is are you on a path to doing more or doing less for your customers? And it's so true because we often talk about, if the status quo is keeping things the same, you're actually, eroding service, you're
Yeah,
eroding relationships, you're eroding all these things that eventually, people fester in them. They don't necessarily communicate their concerns back, and then they
totally.
churn. And there's so many parallels in the SaaS industry. Of course, is like how do you keep the relationship healthy, aside from whether the product is delivering or not. In many ways, the relationship in MSP is kind of what affords you the ability to make occasional mistakes here and there. So I would imagine the same is true in SaaS, and you must see that pattern repeated often with
All
customers.
the
Yeah.
time. Totally.
Now, I know community is big for you, and you've often been on the SaaStr streams. Jason Lemkin and the community he's built with SaaStr is incredible. This folks listening today may not be familiar with SaaStr, but check out their weekly Wednesday streams. They often bring in very, very high performing SaaS companies to talk about very intricate or nuanced parts of their business, which I find always fascinating. But you did a post a little while back about the top 10 mistakes you've made in the past. And I won't read them all off, but one of them was not being prescriptive enough early enough. And
Ah,
so I wanted to ask you about that one because it feels like straight from the book of installing a methodology for our customers to follow when you're creating a product about something they need to be doing.
yeah,
So
pretty
yeah, tell me about that, not being prescriptive enough, early enough.
Yeah, I think that a natural thing when you have a new business, whether it's a new software business or maybe even a service, is that, you're trying to figure out what clients should be doing. And they want to know from you what they should be doing, right? Because part of when somebody buys something from somebody else, they're not just buying the thing, they're buying the knowledge of how to use the thing, right? And so what should they be doing? And you'll hear this a lot, like customers will say, "What do your best clients do? What do your typical clients do here? What are your best practices?" Things like that. And I remember in the early days of Gainsight because it was kind of a new space, a new type of job, new software, new everything. And people would say, Nick or whoever they're doing, not just me, what are your best practices on using Gainsight or deploying Gainsight or whatever? And we would say, well, what would you like to do with our product? And then they would say, well, what would you recommend? And we'd be
Yeah.
like, what do you like to do? And so I like it was sort of an infinite loop. And the net was we would deploy and set up our product in a way that was fine, but not really optimally set up. And therefore, they weren't getting the value they could have been getting. Sometimes they would churn. And I learned over time that, you eventually become an expert and you eventually have to become an expert in what you do. You eventually have to get the confidence to tell the customer, though, this is what we'd recommend. Yeah, I know you want to do it this way, but this is what we recommend. And it's
Mm,
tough because if you're a frontline employee in customer success management, if you're an MSP technician, it's hard to have that, confidence, right? When your typical job is resolving issues or being responsive and you want to help people out and you want to, when they say jump, you say how high, right? Like that's kind of the MO of people that go into a client facing role. But to do it really well, you need to actually get to the point where you're really brave. Now part of it is the firm, the MSP, the software company giving the employees like a set of best practices. So they shouldn't just have to invent it on the fly, right? Like
mm,
there should be, here's the things that we recommend. And then the employee can go to the customer and say, yeah, these are the, 10 things we recommend for a customer in your situation. And I personally think, by the way, having, used MSPs before, I think it's actually an incredibly good way to differentiate. Because if you go in, and you're pitching them to work with you, and you said, yeah, here, you're a law firm, we've worked with X number of law firms. Here's the 10 things we recommend based on the nature of your business. We recommend these security policies and whatever.
yeah.
And I think for a lot of people, they'll just do them. You tell them what to do and they'll just do it because they don't want to reinvent the wheel. You might have some clients who are either larger or maybe more innovative or whatever, think they're innovative, and they'll tell you that they want to do it their way, which is fine. Like your client service, you got to do it that way. But in general, we try to tell clients, this is what we recommend. I was a few hours ago, I was on a call with a customer, a potential customer, and they were asking about sequencing. So Gainsight, you deploy it, but it can also connect to like the CRM, the customer relationship management system, like a Salesforce.com. And they were asking about what do you recommend in terms of sequencing, product A versus product B? Do you do one versus the other? Now it'd be easy for me to be like, well, I want them to buy ours first, so let me just tell them that. What I said is I took them through like the pros and cons of each one, and that's more intellectually honest anyways. So I think to the extent you can kind of have a very client-centric, intellectually honest point of view on how to be prescriptive, share it with them. You'll earn their trust, and then hopefully they get more value from your company and stay with you longer because of that.
So there's an interesting parallel in MSP, which is, and I was talking about these roles just as you were joining, because for a long time we've had this idea of account management versus the terminology of vCIO. The vCIO is supposed to be a more strategically focused person, really working with the customer to help them leverage IT for true business outcomes, stuff that they see as valuable from IT. And I think
vCIO,
the
virtual CIO, or
virtual CIO, precisely. Yeah, it's a term that's somewhat derided, I guess, right now because we don't know what it means. It's kind of confusing because everybody kind of paints a slightly different picture about what that role
yeah,
means and
yeah,
how they're doing it. And what a lot of folks end up doing is just a lot of account management. Really, is what it is, filling the white space. Because we talk about this idea that MSPs come in, they sell a base level of service, and then they just spend all their time trying to sell all the other things they didn't sell
yeah,
in the beginning. And in many ways, like you talk about the trust you create by being able to come in and have a conversation. It's not about selling, and so you've had this conversation with you use the term ZIRP, zero interest rate policy, and it's this idea that when you come in to a customer and you did not sell all the products, you're kind of end up in this recurring theme of like, oh well, we need you to buy this now, we need you to buy now. So naturally, a customer, every time you talk to them, you're trying to sell them something, you start to pull away from the relationship.
yeah.
And so this role naturally separates into two different kinds of people. I don't know if you see this a lot in software because it seems so focused on product adoption. but the MSPs are starting to see a real difficulty in scaling relationships, I guess, beyond just this what feels like a transactional approach to account management. And I'm curious just about your thoughts. It's kind of an abstract comment or question, but maybe you've
Yeah,
seen some things out there.
yeah, I don't think I have any rocket science ideas, but I think that maybe two thoughts to consider. So, of course, you want to sell them more services. And by the way, over time, they will benefit from those services. So that's really good. I think the things that maybe you could be armed with, either yourself or your team, are number one is going back to this best practice concept. So if it's like, imagine you have 10 services, right? Security, data protection, whatever they are. Um, Imagine you have kind of like a people call it maturity curve or maturity model. It's like, hey, our clients start here with network management, and then they go here, and then they go here, and here's the benefits as they go along. Here's some customers that have gone through that. People, they generally want to know where to start and like where to go next. And they want to be motivated. Maturity models are kind of great because they motivate you because like, well, I don't want to get stuck there. I want to go further, right? And you can even sort of imagine a world where you say like, our typical client moves here to here to here in 3 months or something, whatever that to the extent that that's relevant. Because I imagine in some cases they might be using a service from another vendor for one of these offerings,
Sure.
but you can kind of use this to consolidate. The second thing is the while relationships aren't everything, human relationships, they actually still matter a lot because at the end of the day, like there's so many choices in services and technology, the other alternatives to what Gainsight does, and so the human relationship matters a lot. And there's the more trite things like, hey, let's take you to a baseball game and stuff like that. That's great. But I think the bigger thing is deeply building a relationship on a human level. So I always tell our salespeople and CSMs, I say, okay, test the relationship if you have a good one. You text with them, and you don't just text with them about work. And bonus points when they need a new job, like let's say it's the IT person at a small business. When they need a job, they're texting you to see if you know anyone,
Mm.
right? That's the kind of thing. So like in the world that I'm in, very fortunate to be in a situation where like even on my phone, probably like 1,000, I'm not exaggerating, like 1,000 CS executives I've had text conversation with over the last few years. And a bunch of them, when they look for their new job, they're like, hey, Nick, what do you think of this company? Or can you introduce me? And so I think there's some element of like deeply building the human relationship and being vulnerable. That's part of it, right? We all know like if you're vulnerable about what's happening in your life, even outside of work, they'll open up to you too. So I think that the human relationship and the kind of best practices maturity model in combination with what you listed around just like selling, right, which is very important. Those ingredients might help.
So let me bring this back around to maybe the shifts or evolution you're seeing in customer success, because I imagine like you feel you're at the forefront of this to some extent, and trying to lead the charge. And AI is playing a big role. You've launched a
Yeah.
lot of features in your product that are AI driven. How do you think about AI just in the context of maintaining relationships, and whether sort of you might lose a little bit of a touch opportunity because of
Yeah,
AI?
I mean, I think that there's still actually I was just looking, there's like a list of jobs least likely to be disrupted by AI.
I
And
saw
like
that.
the world of sales and customer success was on there. And it was called business development, but effectively that's what it is. And so I do think the human relationship is going to be hard to disrupt, like near term at least. But what's nice is you'll be able to build more automation to take the things that aren't human relationship oriented and actually automate those, right? So create those ways to take the things that like only humans can do and have more time for those. So, clearly I'm sure a lot of your clients and maybe, you guys probably in your software are building different automations to help your customers kind of like grow their business and, but without throwing a lot of people at it. I'm sure you guys are doing that.
Yeah.
And that will allow your clients to have more time to serve their clients on a human level. So that's kind of the way I think about it.
Yeah. I think it's very apropos to bring up one of the laws from your customer communities book,
Yeah.
which is this idea that everybody owns the customer. I remember seeing that one in particular, and it just kind of was so close to the MSP industry for me, because as MSPs grow, people come in, they're doing a role, and they don't necessarily feel the ownership of the customer that is so critical to that success. Your thoughts and your views on ownership of the customer?
Yeah, it's interesting because it goes back and forth, I think, in the industry, right? Because on one hand, the statement everyone owns a customer, the good thing about that is it's not just one department. We've all got to be focused on. We can't just depend on a certain role to do all this stuff that you and I've been talking about. On the flip side, you do need somebody who's kind of like the point person, right? Because we all know if everyone owns something, in some ways,
Nobody
no,
owns it.
right? And you can end up in that like the baseball analogy where like the center fielder and left fielder and the ball goes out in the outfield and like who's catching it and neither one does, right? And so I think there's an element that it really is about everyone doing it, but also there needs to be somebody who's kind of like the point person. And that's the thing that I think is it's not a dilemma. It's just something to be aware of is it's a trade-off and it's something you have to sort of balance really well. Now, I think in the organizations that are on this event, there may be one person on that client. So maybe it may be a little bit easier. But I think the thing that, maybe how it applies for this group is that, you want everyone else that's not talking to that customer to feel ownership and responsibility. You want them to say, "Oh wow, okay, well there's a problem. Like, how can I help?" I think that's this is not just this customer success thing, but I think a general thing in like business is, you imagine on email or Slack or Teams or text, somebody says, customer's unhappy. And one response from some of the other folks not talking to the customer is, okay, well, if you need anything, let me know. And another approach is, how can I help? And they're very subtly different. But how can I help is like, hey, put me in coach. Like, I want to lean in and do something. Let me know if you need anything. It's like, okay, well, if you really need something, call me.
Yeah, yeah,
I'd rather not have you call me, but if you need to, call me.
yeah, yeah. I'm happy to help, but don't ask me to actually
Don't
help. Yeah.
ask me to. Yeah.
So in the I guess in the process of installing literally a brand new movement, so to speak, like customer success over time, and you guys weren't the first. I feel like Mark Benioff, Salesforce, kind of
Yeah,
coined it.
Salesforce is the first. They
Yeah.
were the actual first.
But
Yeah.
Frank Slootman is known for having said CS is overhyped.
Yeah.
Do you think a movement like this, has to battle against the feelings of being too hyped or overhyped, or like how much of this is a distraction to the real mission?
Yeah, I mean, and for folks that don't know, Frank Slootman, former CEO of ServiceNow and Snowflake and Data Domain, so legendary CEO, is amazing, just incredible leader. But he does have this book, and I was reading it, and there was this chapter that was like customer success is overhyped or the biggest, most hyped thing in the valley or something. I was like, come on, why'd you have to pick on me? That's not fair. No.
I feel seen.
Exactly. I guess, yeah, maybe I feel that's a positive way to say it. But his argument, which I think there's it's always worth listening to other arguments. His argument is like, customer success is everyone's responsibility, right? Like it's very similar to what we just talked about. So you don't need anyone focused on it. Now, my argument is, usually in business, like you need somebody to be specialized in something, right? And so we need each organization to have somebody on point. And so where I disagree with them is that you don't need a like point person, which some people would call a customer success manager. Where I agree with them is it is everyone's responsibility. So like there's definitely truth to what he says, but I think, he might take it too far for the average organization. Snowflake is this, I think most folks listening have used it or know about it. And it's this company that was like the tiger by the tail. It's like you can't really leave it because you have so much data in there and it naturally grows. So yeah, you probably don't need CSMs there. But as a interesting data point, ServiceNow was his previous company, and everyone watching knows ServiceNow, and it's an amazing company. And when he left, they built a big CSM team. So it's pretty funny. They have like 1,000 CSMs or something like that. It may even be more. And it's funny because, even his old company has, proves that it's still needed and the role is still needed. Now, for an MSP, I'm not saying that you need to create a role called CSM. Like that might not make sense. if you're a small business, having another role may not make sense. But at least philosophically understanding like how do we think about our client relationships differently? I think that's something every organization can do.
Hmm. Do you feel that you're like a sales minded CEO, or do you have that leaning?
I wouldn't say sales minded. Like, for example, my salespeople would be, they're like, don't talk about price, Nick. Don't talk about price because you'll just give it all away. So, so I wouldn't say the close on the bot, how do we close this month? What is the pricing? No, not that. But the customer relationships, absolutely. I love that. Learning from
Yeah.
customers, talked to like 4 or 5 today this morning. Um, and so I love that. That brings me a lot of energy. And then I love the product strategy of the business and then the culture. Those are my three, the things that I really enjoy.
There was an ulterior motive to that question, and it's because I heard you say on, I think it was the Top Line podcast, you said CS is basically sales but with a long term horizon, if
Yes,
I'm
right.
quoting that accurately. And so maybe expand on that concept a little bit, because
Yeah,
I
I
think a
mean,
lot of people feel like they're like, oh, I'm not a salesperson, and they kind of over rotate on this anti sales mentality, I suppose.
yeah, I don't believe in the anti-sales mentality. I think sales is so important and really hard. But then the fundamental is like, what's the time horizon? So, imagine that I was a salesperson or a CSM or whatever, and I called you and said, "Hey, you gonna buy Gainsight today?" Tomorrow I called you and said, "Hey, you gonna buy Gainsight tomorrow today?" And I just called you every day. You'd be like, "Okay, that's not a very valuable salesperson." But you know what? Salespeople are on a quarterly, comp plan. So, how you think about this quarter? Our sales team is very values driven. So, like at the end of the day, like we want to work with the client's timeline, and if that's next quarter, that's fine. But they're still on a quota and they're on a commission plan, and they want to hit their quarterly numbers. And I think CSMs, the opportunity is they're also going to drive revenue, but there's revenue sometimes is not about you do X and then immediately the sale happens the next day. Sometimes you do X and like a year later. For example, let's say the customer is on I know MSP contracts vary, but let's imagine that there's a contract that's 2 years. That's probably a little bit more rare, but let's imagine it's 2 years. And, let's imagine that, you're about a year out from the end of the contract. And there have been a bunch of issues, technical, et cetera. If you are the like just focused on the quarter and you're like, well, that customer's contract's not expiring right now, I'm going to focus on another customer. By the time you get to that quarter when their contract's expiring, it may be too late. They may be like already cutting over to a new partner, or they brought it
Yeah.
in-house or whatever it is, right? And so a lot of customer success is realizing that it is about sales, it is about revenue, but it's about revenue and not being too late about the revenue. And I think that's the reality. That a lot of business decisions are made a while in advance. Some aren't, but a lot of them are. It's not like consumers where, we go to the grocery store and you decide what you want to buy, this or this, and it's like you're buying on the spot, right? That it's not like that. Lots of times the decisions are made, quite a while in advance. And, by the way, it could be something pretty mercurial. Maybe the owner of your client um, had a bad experience. Maybe their laptop was slow to load, whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't even necessarily your fault. But like if you're not all over that now, that owner might be like, hey, yeah, no, we're not staying with this organization. They messed up my laptop. And
Yeah.
so I think basically it's about getting ahead of that cycle.
So insightful. Well, thank you, Nick. I think I'll keep it at that. I know you have probably a busy schedule, and it's probably good that I turned off my notifications. Otherwise, Erica would probably be, "When are you going to get off the call with Nick?"
My assistant Erica, by the way, for folks listening, who's the
uh,
real the real leader of Gainsight. So
right. Yeah. Got to be careful saying things like this. Now you have to give her a significant raise to
well, she
match the
deserves
statement. Yeah.
the all
No,
deserve.
thank you so much. So insightful, and I feel like I'm tuned into a lot of things you're saying now, and because so many parallels to MSPs and how they're maybe making this shift into this customer success era with service, and so this is the thing we're trying to talk about a lot with ScalePad going into the new year and so on. So thank you for your time. I appreciate you, For everybody listening, we're here every Friday at noon Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern. This has been Nick Mehta, CEO at Gainsight, the leader of the customer success industry in SaaS by most measurements today. And thanks for your time and your insights, Nick. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Luis. I really appreciate it.
Well, hang on 2 secs while I just wrap this up, and